Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on a land use audit for walkability. The phrase land use audit is a little bit of a nod to the fact that in the walkability world, we often do walk audits, which is, walking around a street and looking at the streetscape to look at how you can improve it for walkability. So today we wanted to arm you with an overview of the types of things you could think about and look at when you're out and about to start thinking about how our land use patterns should change to support walkability. So before we get into the comments, first, I just want to say that unfortunately, our moderator, Arliss, had to cancel at the last minute. Um, and so I'm doing double duty or triple duty today. I'm going to introduce, I'm going to present, I'm going to help pull up the questions, and we'll do the best we can. But over 1,000 registrants, so we know this is a great topic. So I'm the executive director of America Walks, but before I did this, I was the mayor of Seattle, so we oversaw land use changes. I ran a nonprofit that focused on zoning changes as well as street and parks and open space and other urban issues, and was an advocate in my neighborhood as we went through redevelopment. And I'm joined with by Cary Westerbeck. He's a principal at Westerbeck Architecture, but he's an advocate himself with Bothellites for People-Oriented Places, BOPOP, and has served on, I believe, serves on the Planning Commission. So he has kind of on the ground experience on how these land use practices and rules affect actual buildings. Big thank you to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and our partners. CDC funds this through their Active People, Healthy Nation program, and which wants health through community design. So they care about what the streets look like, but they also want to see how the entire community is designed. So we're really pleased to be able to speak to that piece of the equation. And, thank you to our individual donors. We really need you and appreciate you, and it gives us the freedom to explore topics even without a big grant out there. So we'll make a more formal ask at the end, but if you'd like to be one of these supporters, we'd love to have you. Have a question. Down there in the bottom, there's a Q&A. Enter that in, ask the question there. We'll do our best to pull up the best ones. We want to try to reserve the second half of this webinar for Q&A. Cary and I will do our best to limit our remarks on a topic that we both really care about. And there's a lot of nuance here. So we're going to go through this at a high level, recognizing that almost any one of these topics could support a topic, its own webinar. So many of us are familiar with WalkScore, right? It's become very popularized in the real estate world. And this is a heat map of Seattle, with green being the most walkable and red being less walkable. And I think it's important to point out, even an urban area has nearby less walkable areas. This is something called the EPA National Walkability Index. And it categorizes areas from least walkable to most walkable, dark green being most walkable. And you probably can't read that, but that's the city of Missoula. And I pulled this out for a couple of reasons. One reason is that even in places that we code as rural, there's actually often a walkable core, and Missoula has preserved its walkable core quite well, and it has somewhat walkable next to it. But even though it looks like a lot of land is not walkable, if we actually look at it from a different perspective, the perspective of people, this is a new land use tool you can find on our website. We actually counted the number of people, or rather the census did, and we took their count and added up how many people live in each of those areas. So even though a place like Missoula County, Montana, and you can search this interactive tool by city, county, or state. Um, Missoula County, Montana, actually has most of the people living in the above average or most walkable places. So if you count people, not land mass, it's actually pretty important. And you can see how important it would be then to have a land use or to infill in a way that allows more people to enjoy the walkable places. Now, I shared with you those two maps of walkability because what we know is how much people walk is highly correlated with the land use attributes of where they live. In fact, both the walk score and the EPA national map are derived from the same research and data sets. And what the research was they looked at where places people lived, and they got actual data about how much the people in those places walked. So we're not just guessing that if a person lives in a walkable place, they'll walk more, which is logical, but we actually know from quantitative surveys of people how much they walk and the attributes of the places they live. And it turns out that those indexes of walkability are really tied to land use factors because that's what we have national data sets for. We don't actually have national data sets for where are the sidewalks or where are the street trees or those granular street level things. But we do have data on these other factors. Um, and we know that these factors are associated with walkability. So here they are. And this starts to tell you then what you should look for. One of those factors is the mix of uses and housing density. So this is a classic Main Street. Lots of different stores. There's offices above. Who knows? Maybe some of that is housing as well. Places like this are highly correlated with walkability. This could be a neighborhood business district of a big city. This could be the main street of a small town. Distance to transit stops. You know, transit is the middle leg of a walking trip. And this one's really fascinating, something called intersection density. So these two maps are to the same scale. And how far could you walk if you took a 1 mile walk in a street grid in Seattle, as versus how far could you walk in a sprawling suburb, which is composed of cul-de-sacs? And as you can see, you can walk a lot further on the street grid. And it turns out, if you counted up the number of intersections in the first one, there's a lot more than if you counted in the second. So those are the three primary, and you can dig into the data more. There's methodology at the EPA's Walkability Index if you really want to dig in more. But those are the chief indicators that take you from, kind of this typology that you'd recognize from car dependent, to somewhat car dependent to somewhat walkable, all the way up to moderately walkable and very walkable. Like you can see how the transportation and the land, how this is actually a picture of land use as much as it is transportation. And thank you to Larry Frank for this graphic. Here's another way that I've loved to think about places, and a very simple way is to look at the difference between places and non-places on the map. And what do I mean by that? Well, places are built for people, they're destinations, they're homes, shops, works, parks, plazas, human-oriented streets are places. Non-places are all the space between, all the big roads and freeways. Parking lots are a non-place. And then there's this last category, green space. And I just want to talk about this one a little bit. I may be going too granular here, but we all recognize this little strip of generic green buffer. This is from, some a typical land use requirement. And that's not really a place, and what do I mean by it's not a place? I mean, we may like it because we like the trees, but you could get the trees without having this landscape buffer. Um, a place is where people go to do things. A place has a name. And nobody is going to say, hey, let's gather on that green strip next to the strip mall to play volleyball or to roll out, roll out a picnic blanket and have a picnic. You know you're not really welcome there. So what happens when you look at places and start? These are maps, great piece of work. This place non-place analogy analysis, and we're going to put it in the blog post about this. Was done by a person who he looked at this and he put in blue all the places and he put in red all the non-places. San Francisco, very placeful. Downtown Phoenix, oh, all those parking lots. And you can see what it's doing. It's starting to separate everything from each other, making it less walkable. Um, and then I'll just call this Anywhere USA. Like, as you all can imagine, walking here is going to be extremely difficult because everything is far away with very hostile roads in between them. Um, and what's the biggest culprit? Well, let's start digging into my top five land use changes to improve walkability. So, not surprisingly, reduce or eliminate parking minimums. Um, there's a whole organization called Parking Reform Network. Check them out. There's city after city is reducing or eliminating parking minimums. It makes housing more expensive. It puts all of this distance between destinations. It's not based in science. It often requires many, many more parking spaces than are actually required. It even distorts the buildings. And just this change alone, I can't emphasize enough how important it is. It even has an importance to local businesses because oftentimes local businesses can't open unless they have parking spaces. So that may preclude somebody from being able to open a neighborhood hardware store or something like that because they can't find the parking in the core. Um, but it also, this is my neighborhood of Greenwood, Seattle. Behind that wall is a parking lot. Just removing the requirement for parking minimums means that parking lot was turned into outdoor seating. The wall was reduced, and this is now a more walkable place. In fact, people will gather and hang out by that wall if there's some music playing on the other side of it. This is a convenience store in my neighborhood. You get rid of parking minimums, and now he's putting out tables and canopies, and a food truck arrives, and it's a neighborhood gathering spot where before it was an eyesore. So eliminate parking minimums. Number one, allow mixed uses. This is a big deal. So much of our zoning has created places that are just one type of use. There's the office core, there's the downtown retail, there's the single family zone, and you really need to allow mixed uses. Because when you do that, people are closer to the other places they need to go to. Corner stores is an example. This is in a residential zone, a very popular cafe. If anybody redevelops this building, that cafe disappears, but it's a real asset to the community. Illegal under current law. Home employment. Oftentimes we say you can't run a business out of your home. And yeah, granted, you may not want a machine shop nearby, but allowing people to provide more services out of their house or run larger home businesses, your local zoning code may have restrictions on how big a business can be in a home before it's violating the rules. Um, and then finally, just stores, housing, offices together. And let's go back to this picture. Um, this block was probably developed before there was a zoning code in the city. And those second floors could be offices, it could be housing. You just don't know from looking at it. But this is an example where all of the uses have been put close to each other and the buildings allowed all the uses. There are different reasons we can get this. We don't get this now, besides zoning. Zoning's a factor. There's also issues around financing and the like. But before we had zoning codes that separated uses, we just naturally built places close to each other. It made sense. Legalize more housing types. There's my third, number three. Um, we got rid of all sorts of what's now known as missing middle. Backyard cottages, townhomes, apartment buildings. They can fit into a place and make it great. And there's no reason a single family lot couldn't support multiple units or even a small apartment building. And again, some of our most walkable neighborhoods have that mixture of housing types in place. Connect the streets. Um, this is, at least for walking and biking. And this is a little map I made for a different presentation. This was St. Mary's County in Maryland. You know how Google will map trips for you? I picked a house at the end of one cul-de-sac, and it's right in the middle there where the red dot is, and calculated how long would it take to walk to the other end of the cul-de-sac that was just a backyard apart. 54 minutes, 2.4 miles. The way this was designed, people have to go out to the arterial and go around, and there are destinations all around them, parks, stores, other places. And we designed this so that it's nearly impossible to walk in. And I'll add a corollary. We also see in land use codes that the street type is sometimes based on the building type. Oh, this is the apartment zone. Your street should be wider. Um, and that's not necessarily needed. In fact, maybe you don't need, maybe you just need it to be just for walking and biking and pedestrianized outside of the building. So let's just not assume that larger buildings require wider streets. It's not a good land use proposition. And then the last of the big five, prune unneeded regulation, expedite infill development. Now, this one could take up a webinar on its own. But I think oftentimes what you see, and I'm just going to take it from a conceptual standpoint, you know, we don't treat housing or new business as like a good thing for the community. We treat it as a bad thing that we need to mitigate its impact somehow. So, you know, how much of a setback do we really need in a certain place? You know, why not have it be a duplex, a triplex, or a small apartment building? How much community comment does something have to go through? And I think a lot of that just comes from, is this a public good or is it a public bad? And there are things that governments can do to make it work faster as well. Just like how fast is this going through? Now, there are real building code needs. Like we want our buildings to be safe, and there are requirements that are appropriate. But I think we've also added too many, and we slow down development in a way that hurts us more in the long run because we don't have the local economic activity, we don't have the housing, nor do we have the types of places that support walking and walkability and transit with all of its benefits for health, the economy, the environment, etc. So with that, I just want to say this is an overview. I just want to get you thinking. We're around. We can talk more. This is just a start. You can go much deeper into any of these topics. And I have another expert with me. This is one of my favorite uh, the Seattle Times, talking about the city of Bothell, which closed its downtown block, kept it car free. And I mentioned that Cary was from Bothellites for people-oriented places. It's a suburb of Seattle, and lots of times people say, "Oh, we can't have this. That's Europe." And the question was, Amsterdam, Brussels, Bothell? Yes, indeed. Why not? So I'll use that to turn it over to Cary to take it on from here. Thanks, everybody, and we'll be back for questions in 10 or 12 minutes or so.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome everyone. Yeah, that was our wonderful Main Street. I was quoted in that article, and we worked to get the Main Street closed, and it's still closed. It's been very popular with residents, and it's helped the local businesses. So thanks for everyone for being here. As someone who started a Strong Towns local conversation that Mike mentioned that we call Bothellites for people-oriented places. Um, One of the books I encourage people to read that I felt really strongly about was called Walkable City by Jeff Speck. And we felt so strongly about this book being a great entree to issues like land use and walkability that we actually bought a box of the books and handed them out to elected officials and planning commissioners and so forth. So, and I'm planning commissioner today, so I read the book as well, of course, and evangelized about it. But briefly, Jeff Speck has these wonderful requirements for walkability. Some of you may be familiar with them as American Walk members, but walks need to be useful. So daily life located close at hand, like Mike has covered somewhat here, in an organized way. Think of old main streets. Safe. We all want to feel safe when we're out walking. We're going to the store, the bank, school, whatever, designed to give us, as it says, a fighting chance against to feel safe around cars and anything else that may be dangerous from the streets. Comfortable. That they're scaled correctly and they're attractive to walk by. It says outdoor living rooms. That's a good point. We like friendly sidewalks and streets, and we all know when we're on a street like that, that's comfortable and nice to be on. You want to be there. You want to spend more time there. rather than like vast open spaces that make you feel uncomfortable, like a parking lot or someplace that feels unsafe and too large. And then finally, interesting, unique buildings, signage, trees, all the things that make, again, a downtown walkable and a street delightful. So it's interesting he boiled that down to those four elements, and I always like to share those. And they relate to the sort of work I do as an architect in a small developer in infill. We can move on to the next slide. So this is a building, the first small building I developed about 6 years ago called Fir Street Flats, because there's three levels of flats, but it also has commercial space at the bottom. There's a barber shop on the corner. In fact, I got my hair buzzed there this morning. They're wonderful people. And this was my putting my money where my mouth is, as it were, as a small developer, my first foray into small development. I wanted to show that we could build kind of like some of the places Mike showed earlier, fine grain, well proportioned, um, interesting small buildings living over the shop, which people have done for thousands of years. The circulation, where you get in and out of the building, is at that wood slatted area there, which people find really interesting. In fact, people come and do photo shoots there for senior pictures and so forth. So the building has become beloved, part because of scale and texture and some of those elements that I just talked about in Jeff Speck's uh, four elements of walkability. Um, the also to interesting to note here, the site that this is built on is only 2,600 square feet. The land this is on, and the building is only a little bit smaller than that. There's a driveway around the back where there's some hidden parking that was required at the time. We have actually since repealed the parking requirements for or for the whole city, but for downtown that was particularly important. Um, and So you can't see the parking, which is critical. We'll get back to that in a minute as well. Um, and people really responded to this building after it was built. I was actually just trying to make myself happy. I live at the top floor with my family, and my mom lives in one of the apartments as well. But people really love the proportion, the scale, and they do feel like it. We've got a main street a couple blocks away that it's or harkening back to the kind of the old downtown Bothell, even though it's an otherwise very modern building. The form of the building is more like we used to build a long time ago, and that was the whole intent here. Um, it's also mixed uses, which is surprisingly challenging, like Mike said, because of financing and zoning. And it's sort of an uphill battle to do small mixed use buildings. So that's a regulatory issue and banking issue. And also it can be difficult to make small mixed use viable, but people really respond to it. And I could have had a dozen of these small barbershop spaces. It's about 600 square feet. I could have rented it over and over and over again. It was very, very in demand. Whereas across the street in various directions from my building, there are much larger buildings, the 5 and 6 story buildings we all see that are block sized, that have 3,000 to 4,000 square foot spaces that they often have a challenge renting those out because people often don't need 3 or 4,000 square feet. But a lot of people, small entrepreneurs, want a 5 or 600 square foot space, 1,000 square foot space. Um, and so I was actually trying to, in this building, do some of those things that I mentioned in Jeff Specs for theory of walkability, the four elements: safe, comfortable, scale, interesting, and again, public has responded to it well. I also own the old building behind it. You can see it on the left there. And I want to show some interesting land use elements and sort of put on my developer and architect lens and share with you some of the things that are still tripping us up in our land use environment in the United States and North America. And a couple examples that'll be fun to show. So you can move on to the next slide. So this is that building next door. You can see some frosty day the other day. I took the pictures. When I did this building, the new building, I had the old one there and was leaving it in place. It's a triplex. We will replace it with another building that's larger eventually. As far as my infill strategy goes, developing in downtown Bothell, we had to keep access to the parking that was required at the time, 6 years ago. And the city code requires, and partly because of land use requirements, but also because of fire requirements, which can often be very onerous, especially in a small area, geometrically constrained. There's not a lot of space to work with. They required a 20-foot wide two-lane or two-way driveway curb cut. And you could see that shown there in yellow. I could only use 16 feet because I wasn't going to move the old building. So we sorted it out with the fire department and the planning department. They understood, and it's been working just fine to have the 10 or so cars that parked behind the buildings come and go from that smaller driveway. You know, and there's no problem there with the low numbers of cars coming and going. But this illustrates a point. There's this very hard and fast rule that because it's a commercial building and not, say, a home, it's like a single family home or a duplex or something, that you have to have this 20-foot wide driveway. That's the minimum. I think it's 20 to 24 is required. So that's something I'm actually trying to change as a planning commission member in our downtown plan that we're updating right now that dictates zoning for downtown Bothell. But be on the lookout for things like this in your zoning code. Like 20 feet is excessive. And in fact, the city of Seattle, where Mike used to be mayor, they actually have a 10-foot maximum for a lot of small housing project types. So kudos to Seattle for knowing that you don't want excessive curb cuts. This just really denudes walkability and it's unnecessary. I could see this for the building next door, which has 300 units and they have a lot of people coming and going. This is often not necessary for small projects. So a lot of zoning codes in the United States are coded or written for very large projects. And so that's one of the first orders of business, I think, for people like ourselves, advocates who want more walkability, is to go look at things like this and say, does this make sense? We can move on to the next slide. So here's my putting on my developer architect hat. Oh, sorry. Yeah, we go. What do you notice? So this is another project we've completed recently. We did the building in the middle there. It's 4 townhouses. That's what it was zoned for. And there's parking tucked around the back. And I can't ask 1,000 of you what you noticed, but I do want to point out on the left side, we've got a historic building owned by the Cloverleaf Rebeccas, and that was built in the early 20th century. And then we've got our building in the middle, which is 4 townhouses, 2 in the front, 2 in the back, and there's a courtyard in the middle. And then we've got a late 20th century zoning code duplex on the right. And again, I can't ask the question of all of you, but I say, what do you notice? And for most people, I hope you would say the right one, the late 20th century zoning code required a whole lot of driveway and parking out front. Well, kudos to Bothell, because when they rewrote their land use plan, the downtown plan, they were now updating, but when they rewrote it in 2010, they said, we don't want all these driveways on this main street, this walkable street, which is only a block from Main Street anymore. So the code that we had to build these new buildings under, they said, you got to have entrances, you got to build close to the street. And they were trying to get back to sort of the building pattern you see on the left from the early 20th century, which is in many ways what we're doing with modern planning is what did we do right before that made things walkable, attractive, safe, utilitarian? And so we can't do that driveway and the cars in front anymore. I love that the photographer got the photo of the day that the neighbors had all their cars in front. I don't think that was intended. Real quick. So anyway, and there is parking out back because it was required at the time. Again, it's not anymore, but you can't see it. And that is really where we would like to see the parking. And if there's going to be some, it's tucked in the back, accessed by an alley. So it's fun to see this is basically 100 years of planning all in the 3 buildings. You can see how we've kind of come back around to what worked. As a developer, these are the things I just wanted to share. This is what I'm thinking about when I'm doing a design for a client or it's one of my own projects. The fire department requirements all over the United States are often designed again for very large streets. Ironically, those large streets are kind of have to be more dangerous, requiring us to use more fire department resources and people getting hurt and hit by cars and so forth. So I feel like there's this ongoing conversation. Fire always gets whatever they want, but it can contribute to some very dangerous roads, which again, there's probably an opening for conversation for you with your folks in your town about how fire requirements might be making some of the streets more dangerous. Then I always want to bring up my building that I showed you a little bit ago. The black one is a good example of this. In Japan and Europe and South America and the Middle East, they'll use every little sliver of land for something. Coffee shops, donut shops, whatever, yarn shops, et cetera, you name it. And we have not necessarily done that in the last 80 years in the United States, but I hope that we are going to start thinking about that in our town. If you have a little sliver of land, especially if you remove parking requirements suddenly and maybe fewer setbacks required, you can start to use those little slivers of land. And those are the things that make a city really special. And that I think we all enjoy when we go to old towns or we travel to other countries. And that leads to a code that requires that you build building big buildings on big parcels, big driveways, big roads. That's how we've done things in North America for a long time. And again, trying to unpack that and to say, why are we doing that? And is that giving us the best town, the best walkable town, the safest town? And I think that a lot of us are rethinking that now. Can we allow people to build smaller things, smaller scale, closer together, and create more in smaller areas? It's a geometry problem once again. And that leads me to one of my favorite things is I just let people do things. If it's not going to be dangerous to the community, let those entrepreneurs try to use those small lots. Let them let them find ways working with your city to or your county, whatever, to try to allow people to start small businesses in small spaces more easily, as long as they're not going to be hurting anyone. Mike's already covered this well. Minimize curb cuts, so driveway cuts in the sidewalks. They really hinder walkability, and we can often make them smaller than they are. I think we could frequently have smaller curb cuts or fewer or none, if especially if there's a street out back or alley or something like that. And a lot of planners are starting to think about that a lot harder than they used to. And finally, our mayor says this a lot, our local Bothell mayor, Mason Thompson, but you get what you build for. So we as a city are really trying to turn the barge at this point and go from planning for cars and large buildings and starting to plan for what we want, which is people who can walk places safely, get their kids on their scooters, skateboards, bikes, whatever. You get what you build for, what you plan for. So we're trying to bring that to public works and our planning department, everything, and infuse our planning for the next 20 and 30 years with what do we want to attract, what do we want to do, who do we want to be as a city and a town, and if it's walkability, how are we planning for that as far as how we plan our city and engineer that, and when we do new streets, and so that's a mindset that we're trying to adopt. And that is it for me. Hopefully we've left enough time for Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, I was talking to myself there because I was muted, but I'm back. That was great, Cary. Thank you so much.
A
And
pleasure.
we have awesome questions from the audience, and I'm just gonna start launching in. And we did it, 11:33, Cary.
A little over, but yeah, thanks.
No, I would think I was over. I think you were perfect. Um, there's a lot of really great questions you have in here, and I'm gonna start with what guidance would you get? No, I'm gonna start with a different one because I think this is a really important one. How is consensus built on the need for these rule changes for decision makers, such as elected officials and neighborhood level leaders like civic associations, for example? And I'll start speaking to that how because I do, in fact, think that's a really important question, and I don't want to make believe it's easy. I think one of the real challenges that we face in this world is that safe street design and land use too are arguments for these are really strong. I believe, from a benefits provided to a community, but there's oftentimes a lot of resistance. People are fearful of what these changes might bring. So there isn't really, my short answer could be a very long answer here. The long answer would be teaching you how to build relationships and organizing. The short answer is you really have to start showing that there is, in fact, some public demand in the community and some understanding. And that means just going out and meeting people and talking to people and finding allies. But we are finding, I think, that the housing crisis and the lack of affordable housing has changed the debate in a lot of places about the desirability of allowing more housing. We've just gone too far. And I think also there are a lot more advocates out there in the world for the types of granular, useful, fun local things, like pedestrianized streets, like food trucks, like more parklets, like more small local businesses, etc. So it really is just a question of kind of building local and support for it. And it's something that actually can cut across ideological lines, we find. This is something that, in a world that feels very blue and red sometimes to us, this is something that you will find lots of small business people or people, whatever their ideology is, they'll be like, yeah, the good regulations are better than bad regulations, more activity is better than less activity. And it's just trying to overcome the fear of people that the change will make their community worse when indeed it'll make it better. Cary?
My response to that might be uh, thinking about my experience with creating Bothellites for people-oriented places. I knew I wanted to make change, and I liked some of the changes that were happening. I wanted to support the city and some of their efforts to transform our downtown. So my advice was go find your people and coalesce into a group that has conversations regularly, and then decide how you want to go approach as a coordinated group and ask for the things you want. And that has led to real change in my small city of 50,000 people.
And as I recall, Cary's start was just who would like to meet and talk about this stuff on a Facebook group. And that
Yeah, I
that
literally
launched
just
it.
exactly who's interested. Not trying to coerce anyone. Just if you're interested in this, I'm interested. Let's start chatting, and has led to quite a bit of change. And a lot of folks who were in that group now are the decision makers and electeds in our city as well.
Here's another question, two-parter. What guidance would you give to mid-sized to small cities that have less density? And the second part of it is she came in later in the questions. I'm searching for it. Um, because big cities like Toronto, Seattle, Chicago are different from Eugene, Asheville, Roanoke, Corvallis. So Cary, you live and work in a small city of Bothell.
Yeah, I always actually appreciated that. So I live near Seattle, so just minutes away, and I have a lot of friends who live there. I've lived there myself. I don't know for years. It's been a while, but point I want to make is I feel kind of grateful that I'm in a smaller city because we actually were able to move the needle on a lot of the things we were interested in as a advocacy group, and get appointed to commissions, and some ran for elected office, as I mentioned a minute ago, much more easily than we could say in a city of roughly 1 million people like Seattle. So I'd say try and use it to your advantage because you can actually do more faster often by digging in and getting to work in those smaller cities. So I would think of that as an advantage. It's a lot harder to move the needle in Toronto or Seattle or LA.
Yeah, I'm gonna echo that. I think that the levels of process can get really difficult in a city and it's a big city and harder to make it more flexible. I also want to say I think that small cities and towns that are less tense often really have opportunity. And I've lived in Eugene, I've been to Corvallis a lot, haven't made it to Asheville or Roanoke, but I think Eugene and Corvallis, Oregon are great examples. Now, again, they're college towns, and I think college
Yeah,
towns have a little bit of an advantage because they already have a big walking population in college students. But they also, both cities also had an historic street grid that they've invested in. And I can think of a lot, one of my favorite things to do when I'm on a longer road trip, which I love a good long road trip, is I'll take the business 90 rather than the I-90, and I can see the glory of places that used to be, and I can see the street grid, and I can see some of the great old buildings. There's usually lots of infill opportunities, and I think one of the things we've seen in the parking reform movement is that it's often been led by those smaller or mid-sized cities that recognize the economic burden they're placing on new businesses by requiring them to find parking. In fact, a lot of those parking lots in those towns are somebody buying a building and tearing it down to meet the parking minimum requirement for their existing building when they opened a new business. So just allowing people to do stuff, I love that line, Cary, is good. And I'll give you another example of that, of kind of that flexibility. I saw one of the questions in the chat is from Nigel Herbig, who's from Kenmore, the neighboring community.
Hi, Nigel.
Yeah, and one day I was biking along the Burke Gilman Trail, a very popular trail, and there was a brewery there, and I stopped in, and one day I had the opportunity to ask Nigel about it. The brewery, which had a big open room and outdoor seating and was really a great community place, was a light industrial space at the north end of Lake Washington. And when they put in their brewery application, that triggered. So again, this is a change of use that triggered a ton of code requirements about parking, about the building, about other things. And the city of Kenmore, in its wisdom, said, we'd rather have a brewery in the existing building than nothing in the existing building, which was the choice, because those code requirements would have prevented it from opening. So you have a lot of those requirements in place. And so I'll answer kind of going back to an earlier question. One of the things we did in Seattle when I was mayor was we pulled together a group that included, neighborhood advocates, environmentalists, uh, property owners, developers, and we actually had an exercise to try to prune unneeded regulations. Like, what are your pain points and what are the things that are bad? And the other people would look at those and go, yeah, we don't care about that anymore. And we managed to get most of them through the council, and it made a difference. And kind of that regular process can be really great, finding out what the pain points are. Um, okay, so I think small cities and mid-sized cities have tremendous opportunities actually, and are actually at the cutting edge of starting to enhance economic activity. And I'd love to see more of them keeping their civic institutions or major employers in downtown rather than a greenfield. Again, that's oftentimes driven by the parking minimums or other building code requirements. You'd rather have things close than far, and there's really tremendous opportunity everywhere.
Yeah, if people can advocate for reducing or eliminating parking requirements, making it optional, letting the landowner or the entrepreneur or whoever the developer decide. I know it seems like a bridge too far for some, but you'll find it's not going to change things tremendously, but it's going to create a number of opportunities for people who can make use of those infill lots, who, especially in established downtowns with those missing teeth and things like that. Suddenly, and there's a success stories of Arkansas and other places that Strong Towns and the other organizations have written about, but towns will literally blossom once they can start to use those spaces. So I cannot overemphasize how important it is to reduce some of those barriers, especially ones that don't create any danger.
Um, so many good questions about that are kind of getting into the details. I'm gonna try to keep um, a little higher up on this on the on this issue. Let's see. Can you speak to the aspects of state level policy that might inhibit or enhance ability to advance these type of environments at the local level where people experience them? I think that's been a really good question. Historically, land use and street design have been, for locally owned streets, have been set by the local city councils. And then you have the problem that state roads or county roads, the design standards might be set by the county or state. So, and that's oftentimes in a small town, the central intersection of a small town might be two state highways. And now you've got the state highway department setting the standards because they're thinking about highways, not about the place. Um, but buildings are almost always, land use has almost always been a local thing. And what we've seen over the last few years is that states are stepping in to either dictate, and I know that's a strong word, but to say, no, we have to have certain minimum levels of responsiveness to housing demand. So the state of Washington, for example, is requiring everybody to eliminate single family zoning and allow each lot to support up to 4 units, with some exceptions. And some places are really fighting that. The state of Oregon said, yeah, you can set parking minimums, but only if you do a study first. And this turned out to be remarkably effective because a lot of cities and towns, they went to their city council members and said, yeah, we could do a study, it would take a lot of time, or we could just get rid of the minimums. So it kind of gave the nudge that a lot of them needed to get rid of it. So I think what you see is that state level action occurs. But I think the value of local conversation around this does remain tremendously important, and the support for that remains important as well. So it's, you should be looking to your city or town first, but if you're having difficulty and you meet with people from other cities or towns in the same position, maybe it's time to look to the state to try to reset the standards because of the benefits that it brings. Cary, any thoughts on that? Or
Sorry, I got distracted because I was trying to answer someone else's question, but I was looking at
okay,
something.
okay.
My apologies.
Um,
Someone asked about corner stores and corner retail, and I just wanted to direct them, and I was going to give them a quick link, but I won't take much time on this. Washington Department of Commerce did a really very thorough and very good guide on uh, corner stores and uh, residential retail accessory commercial units. And the city of Bothell actually passed corner stores being allowed. We legalized them this last summer. So I wanted to direct them to that. I can't find it at the moment, but there's some really good guidance from the Washington State Department of Commerce. They have a whole PDF on it, on how your town could go about it. It's extremely thorough. So I just wanted to plug that because I think it's a good resource for any town, any city in America could use that.
yeah, and I want to say, I think a lot of people don't appreciate how complex use restrictions get. So basically, we oftentimes have thought about zoning as being about and the height, size, setback, the building envelope questions. But in fact, there's a lot of stuff in a lot of codes about uses. And you may have heard the term form-based code. And one of the things about a form-based code is to say regulate uses less, just regulate the look of the building. If we go back to that Main Street design, there was no regulation on the uses in that building. But you will find today, so for example, again, I'm using local examples because I'm most familiar with them. Um, my neighborhood of Greenwood had a pedestrian overlay put on it. So you could have a coffee shop, but you couldn't have a travel agent because a travel agent didn't attract enough pedestrians. And this is the type of use restriction that if you have an empty storefront that a travel agent wanted to pay the rent on, if they want to pay the rent on it, like let's fill it rather than say we're only going to reserve it for people who we think support enough. There's this kind of top-down, organized, that it's actually not very nuanced and responsive to the actual needs of the street. Like let's trust people to pick the location to work for them. Theoretically, the rent would be higher in that pedestrian zone because of the presence of pedestrians and the travel agent. I'm now dating myself. This is an older example. I don't even know if they're travel agents anymore. Travel agent would pick a different place. The dentist office would pick a different place than the high pedestrian place because they don't need the walk by traffic. But let them make that decision. Don't do it in advance. Certainly, you also see a situation where we've required ground floor retail where there's just not enough demand to support the ground floor retail. Let the person build the housing in that case. Like let the individual property owners have more agency about the type of building in that spot or the individual renters. And I think that's a big deal. There's a series of questions in here about cul-de-sacs. What do you do that has a place that has a lot? How can you prevent getting them in the first place? And I will admit, that this is a little bit outside of my personal experience, but here's what I know is that we did see in a lot of places that, the master planning for a lot actually started calling for cul-de-sacs. So you will find it in the planning manuals. It's like what's the acceptable type of street. So that plan for a subdivision or land use also has to go through, also has to get approval. And that cul-de-sac design is not just responding to um, market demand, it's also responding to requirements that may be found in the code about how to do it. Now, I think what's interesting is I have seen and heard from people who do those types of developments who intentionally make sure that they're fully connected through the middle with walking and biking paths. In fact, they oftentimes sell it that the walking and biking path gets wide enough to support an emergency vehicle. So it also supports an emergency access to all of the places, even if the cars can't get through. In other places, you see they're built for walkability from the outset. So I think trying to get upstream of that is difficult, and there's just a lot of these things have become embedded in codes. So the same recommendations apply there. I think the retrofitting gets extremely difficult because of the require to condemn land to make the connections. Now the land is all on private property, and you didn't get it in place in the first place. Um, but again, I think that's why it's so important then to start prioritizing infill development in the places where you already have the connections, and a good street grid is one of the things I would say there. But I think we may need to bring in another expert on this one for a future webinar to talk about that kind of larger master planned development that are on the edges of town and what are best practices there. I think that would be a really useful future webinar. And in fact, I've been talking to the Urban Land Institute about this, who are knowledgeable folks on this. Um, how I have two different questions that are similar, and I'll just say it. One is, what about neighbors who don't want more cars parking on their street when we reduce parking? And I think a related question is, boy, I'd love a pedestrianized street in my business district, but I think that the businesses think they need the parking for business purposes. So, Cary, you want to take a shot at either of those?
Yeah, a little bit on both those. One thing that's very interesting, Brent Tudaran, one of the kind of preeminent North American planners who used to be the senior planner for City of Vancouver and now does his own, he consults internationally for large cities. He was involved probably 15 years ago or so in putting in helping the city of Vancouver put in bike lanes in a number of busy downtown streets. And this is a now sort of famous story, but the shop owners, I should say, it's often big buildings and hundreds of businesses were very against it. They fought it quite a bit, putting that bike lane in and making it more walking friendly as well. Well, they did it anyway, and a few years later, they found they were getting a lot more business. They were making more money, all these businesses. It turned out it was quite a boon for these businesses and these streets that they put the bike lanes and the better sidewalks on to have them be bike lanes and walkable places. Now you could not pry it from them. They are the biggest advocates of that kind of planning now, and they're kind of evangelizing for it throughout the rest of the city. So that's up in Vancouver, BC. We see smaller versions of that all over, and there are studies in various cities. I don't have one off the top of my head, but I do read about these on occasion where they find that a very small percentage of business is coming from the cars that drive through, and a lot more is coming from people who are walking into that business district, particularly older main streets and things like that, where parking is often just the geometry problem alone. There's only so much room for cars, so the parking is is precious. They find that they're getting a lot more business from people walking, riding bikes, nearby neighborhoods and stuff than they expected, and so it's often opposite of what one would think. And So that was, and then the parking, a lot of cities are wrestling with that. Bothell is, we've got a branch of the University of Washington here. And so they've had a parking pass system for years there so that students won't necessarily fill the neighborhood and residents have access to those spots first. So there are ways, and Donald Shoup's book, High Cost of Free Parking, covers a lot of these systems as well. Charging moderate amounts for parking so that it's turned over regularly. So there's a lot of tools in the toolbox to deal with how to make sure the parking's there for the people who need it.
Yeah, I think that one of the things I've seen done is what they call intercept surveys. You have to get people out there with
Mm.
clipboards, talking to people visiting stores, and how did you get here? And oftentimes you'll find that, and it varied by business district across Seattle, but business owners oftentimes underestimated the number of visits that came from people using transit or walking. Um, I think the other thing you'll see is that eliminating parking minimums does not prevent a business from making some decisions on how to do parking. Um, but one of the best things you could do is actually start locating some customers nearby. So again, we start going to that infill housing as well. So should the city invest in a new parking garage to entice people to drive, or should it make it easier to build housing nearby? And one of the things you see is that housing density is highly correlated with the business density. Retail follows people if it's allowed to follow people. and people will start filling in the retail spaces, and that can make it easier. So not an easy solution, and the fear of parking is very strong. The fear of loss of parking is strong, and oftentimes in residential neighborhoods it's strong too. Um, but at a certain point, I think you get to, is it the government's job to ensure everyone has a parking space, or is it the government's job to ensure everybody has a home? And is it the government's job to assure that there are destinations nearby and that they have a healthy neighborhood? And so there are definitely trade-offs, but a lot of those trade-offs can be dealt with if you make it easy, if you don't require as much in the way of setbacks, provide more options for how people can park on their property, things like that. That can help you get there. And I also think it's, just a reminder, and we do our National Week Without Driving, 30% of the people in this country don't have access to a vehicle or don't drive. There's a lot more non-walkers than you might think. Non-drivers, excuse me, a lot more non-drivers than you think, and a lot of people walking or rolling or using other means. And I think we lose them in the conversation. And that has, serious concerns for fairness to people as to who we're serving. So I would argue that a place with lots of housing and jobs is likely to provide more opportunity to people than a place with lots of parking spaces and wide roads and empty spaces between buildings. So
And that 30% non-drivers is a good point because we've actually had groups that represent that 30% come uh, do public comment at our city several times saying, please don't forget about us. And that's helped us keep a focus on um, making sure useful transit is planned, long term through our downtown, which we now have a bus rapid transit route since we don't have the light rail system coming through our city, prioritizing safe intersections and things. So we very much want to think about that 30% of our city.
okay, I'm going to do a few quick ones. Can this land use audit be used to highlight inequities in the built environment and how it might inform targeted public health interventions in communities that need it most? Yes, absolutely. And I think you need to, start looking at that. And I raised that as well. How does creating, upgrading accessibility come into play, especially with municipalities with less funding? I know municipal planning code requires, but sometimes the cost to improving accessibility can be a tall ask between costs and other more flashy improvements, developments that are low-hanging fruit. Yes, tragically and unfortunately, we see that lots of cities find they do not have the funds for basic infrastructure like curb cuts and ADA accessible walkways, etc. In fact, in many cities, sidewalks themselves are made the responsibility of the property owner, not the community. Kudos to the city of Denver, Colorado, which has created a street utility to finance its sidewalk system. But we can also see that then so much of the money continues to go to expansion of, roadways or highways to bring more people and cars into this place that is already deficient for walking or rolling or for seniors or for kids or for those with disabilities. So I think that this is part of the shift of prioritizing places for the people outside of vehicles rather than the people inside of vehicles that we're talking about, and trying to get some of those shifts in funding. I will also say that reducing distances between places, that place non-place analysis, really matters, I think, to creating that type of place where somebody can age in place. It's one of the reasons why AARP is such a supporter of livable communities. As they say, most people are going to live, 7 to 9 years past their ability to drive. It could be tremendously isolating for an older person to lose their car key and not be able to get to close by destinations. So I think that there's a lot of accessibility reasons to focus on having placeful places rather than too many non-places that make it impossible to move unless you're in a car. I think there's a huge accessibility thing, but I don't want to undermine the point made about the funding already is tilted away from taking care of those basics like accessibility, which all of us are going to need it probably at some point in our lives. Um, I'm 66. I'm feeling it every day, so I get it too. Okay, we're at the hour. We did not get all of the way through all of the questions. Here, I'll do another quick knockoff. How does America Walks envision the tool of the I assume they mentioned, I assume they're referring to the tool that I raised about I don't know what tool they're referring to. We're thinking about putting together a tool on top five changes to walkable, the land use audit. We're thinking about creating a land use audit toolkit, and we may bring that out for a way for just regular folks to go out and look at things. If the tool was our index or our view of walkable land use, go take a look at your county or state, see how it measures up to other counties or states. This is data you can bring. I think the main reason we're doing that tool is we can change the places we live to make them more walkable, but we can also allow places that are walkable to have more people in them. And that really works for those people. If the next new house is built on a underused parking lot in a place that already has destinations nearby, you could serve, 10, 15, 30 people, as opposed to a subdivision of 15 houses on the edge of town, requires a car. So we can do a lot just by making it easier to do infill. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. I now need to find my slideshow again. And um, here we go. I now need to find my screen again with all of you on it so I can share. I realize we're going to lose you all. We want you to, we will be putting this together. We will be sending it out to everybody. Um, and I would ask all of you, please, if you like what we're doing, if you would like to support us more, please do so. There's a little QR code there. Point your phone at it. If you can go to our website, we're pretty easy to find. The donate is right up at the top of the page. Developing the resources we're talking about and doing all of the things we want to do takes resources. We are tremendously grateful to our major funding partners, but you will not be surprised to learn that the funding environment is a little more challenging for nonprofits like ours right now than it has been in the past, and your individual support makes a difference. So join those that have already supported us. We'll go out there and keep spreading the good word about how to create great walkable communities. And I want to thank all of you for what you already do in your own communities. Thanks.